All right, well, we've reached chapter 3, and I'm sure this is the one everybody's been waiting for. Annabelle. When the telephone rings at the Warrens' house, and a somber-toned clergyman on the other end of the line asks for Ed Warren, there's a better than even chance that something serious has happened. Such was the case with Annabelle. The referral this time came from an Episcopal priest. Calling from the church's administrative offices in Connecticut, the clergyman was relaying a message he'd received from a minister elsewhere in the state. Though the information the priest had was sketchy, he nonetheless told Ed Warren that two young nurses had communicated with what they thought to be a human spirit. The priest doubted that was the case, however, because the plea for help included the fact that one of the girl's friends had been attacked physically. Though the wounds were not serious, activity was still in progress, and one of the girls seemed to think there was something alien inside her apartment. Would you, he asked, investigate the case further, and as a demonologist, recommend if a formal church action should be taken? Agreeing with the clergyman's assessment that something of a negative spirit nature might conceivably be at work, Ed Warren accepted the referral. With that, the priest gave Ed the phone number and names of the two young women. After speaking with the priest, Ed immediately called the number he'd been given. Upon reaching one of the nurses, Ed verified the existence of the problem and told the young women that he and Lorraine were on their way. Though traffic was light on the interstate that day, it took the Warrens well over an hour to reach the address of the modern, low-rise apartment complex. After parking the car, the Warrens walked up to the front door, and Ed rang the bell. He carried with him a tape recorder, camera, and a black attaché case. Footsteps soon approached from inside. Bolt locks were unsnapped, and the door was opened by Deirdre Bernard, an attractive but sober-faced young lady of 25. Ed and Lorraine Warren introduced themselves and were then ushered into the apartment. The young nurse led the Warrens through a spacious living room into the kitchen. There Cal Randall and his fiancée, Laura Clifton, sat at the table drinking coffee. Deirdre introduced the Warrens to them, but the young people said very little. The serious, drawn look on their faces said it all. The Warrens then took a seat with the others at the table. After loading a cassette into the recorder, Ed switched on the machine and entered the time, date, address, and full names of the principals. "Okay," Ed said. "I'd like to hear the whole story right from the beginning. Who here can tell me?" "I can," said Deirdre. "All right, Cal. Laura, please add any details she leaves out," Ed directed. "There are two stories, really," Deirdre said. "One that began earlier in the week with Cal. The other one's about Annabelle, but I suppose they're both about Annabelle. I'm not sure." "Who's Annabelle?" Ed promptly asked. "She belongs to Deirdre," Laura replied. "Belongs?" questioned Lorraine. "Is Annabelle a living, breathing being?" "Is she alive?" Deirdre repeated quizzically. "She moves. She acts alive, but no, I don't think she's alive." "Annabelle's in the living room," said Laura, pointing across the table. "She's sitting on the sofa." Laura looked to her left, into the living room. "Are you talking about the doll?" "That's right," Laura replied. "The big Raggedy Ann doll. That's Annabelle. She moves." Ed got up and walked into the living room to inspect the doll. It was big and heavy, the size of a 4-year-old child, sitting with its legs stretched out on the sofa. The black, pupilless eyes stared back at him, while the painted-on smile gave the doll an expression of grim irony. Looking it over, without touching the thing, then Ed returned to the kitchen. "Where does the doll come from?" Ed asked Deirdre. "It was a gift," Deirdre replied. "My mother gave it to me on my last birthday." "Is there some reason why she bought you a doll?" Ed wanted to know. "No, it was just something novel, a decoration," the young girl answered. "Okay," Ed went on. "When did you first start noticing activity occur?" "About a year ago," said Deirdre. "The doll started to move around the apartment by itself. I don't mean it got up and walked around or any such thing. I mean, when we'd come home from work, it would never be quite where we left it." "Explain that part a little more," Ed requested. "After I got the doll for my birthday," Deirdre explained, "I put it on my bed each morning after the bed was made. The arms would be off to its side and its legs would be straight out, just like it's sitting there now. But when we'd come home at night, the arms and legs would be positioned in different gestures. For instance, its legs would be crossed at the ankles, or its arms would be folded in its lap. After a week or so, this made us suspicious. So to test it, I purposely crossed its legs and arms in the mornings to see if it really was moving. And sure enough, every night when we come back home, the arms and legs would be uncrossed and the thing would be sitting there in any of a dozen different postures. Yes, but it did more than that, Laura put in. The doll also changed rooms by itself. We came home one night and the Annabelle doll was sitting in a chair by the front door. It was kneeling. The funny thing about it was, when we tried to make the doll kneel, it'd just fall over. It couldn't kneel. Other times we'd find it sitting on the sofa, although when we left the apartment in the morning, it'd be in Deirdre's room with the door closed. Anything else? Lorraine asked. Yes, said Deirdre. It would leave us little notes and messages. The handwriting looked to be that of a small child.
What did the notes say? Questioned Ed.
It would say things that meant nothing to us, Deirdre answered. Things would be written like, help us, or help Cal. But Cal wasn't in any kind of jeopardy at the time. And who us was, we didn't know. Still, the thing was weird was that the notes would be written in pencil, but when we tried to find out, there was not one pencil in the apartment, and the paper it wrote on was parchment. I tore the place apart looking for parchment paper, but again, neither of us had any such thing.
It sounds like someone had a key to your apartment and was playing a sick joke on you, Ed stated flatly.
That's exactly what we thought, said Deirdre. So we did little things like put marks on the windows and doors, or arrange the rugs so that anyone who came in would leave a trace that we could see. But never once did it turn out that there was any real outside intruder. While the doll was moving around and we'd become suspicious of burglars, something else screwy happened, Laura added next. The Annabelle doll was sitting on Deirdre's bed as was usual. When we came home one night, there was blood on the back of its hand, and there were 3 drops of blood on its chest. God, that really scared us, Deirdre said frankly.
Did you notice any other kind of phenomena occur in the apartment? Ed asked them.
One time around Christmas, we found a little chocolate boot on the stereo that none of us had bought. Presumably, it came from Annabelle, said Laura. When did you come to determine there was a spirit associated with the doll? Questioned Lorraine. We knew something unusual was going on, Deirdre answered. The doll did change rooms by itself. It did pose in different gestures. We all saw it. But we wanted to know why. Was there maybe some plausible reason why the doll was moving? So Laura and I got in touch with a woman who's a medium. That was about a month, or maybe 6 weeks after all this stuff started to happen. What did you find out? We learned that a little girl died on this property, Deirdre told the Warrens. She was 7 years old, and her name was Annabelle Higgins. The Annabelle spirit said she played in the fields long ago, before these apartments were built. They were happy times for her, she told us. Because everyone around here was grown up and only concerned with their jobs, there was no one she could relate to except us. Annabelle felt that we would be able to understand her. That's why she began moving the rag doll. All Annabelle wanted was to be loved, and so she asked if she could stay with us and move into the doll. What could we do? So we said yes.
Wait a minute here, Ed interjected. What do you mean it wanted to move into the doll? Do you mean it proposed to possess it?
Right, that was the understanding, Deirdre replied. It seemed harmless enough. We're nurses, you know. We see suffering every day. We had compassion. Anyway, we called the doll Annabelle from that time on. Did you do anything different with the doll after you learned it was supposedly possessed by a little girl spirit named Annabelle? Asked Lorraine. Not really, said Deirdre, but of course it wasn't just a doll anymore. It was Annabelle. We couldn't ignore that fact.
All right, before you go any further, let's back up a minute, Ed requested. First, you got the doll for your birthday. After a while, the doll began to move, or at least change places enough for you to notice it. This made you curious, so you decided to have a seance, and a spirit came across that called itself Annabelle Higgins. This supposed little girl spirit was 7 years old and asked if it could come alive with you by possessing the toy doll. You said yes out of compassion. Then you renamed the doll Annabelle, right? Right, said Deirdre and Lara. Have have you seen the ghost of a little girl at any time in this apartment? Ed asked. No, both the girls answered. You said a chocolate item showed up here once, said Ed. Has anything else strange ever happened that you couldn't explain? One time a statue lifted up across the room, Deirdre recalled. Then it tumbled in the air and fell on the floor. None of us were near the statue. It was on the other side of the room. That incident frightened us totally. Let me ask you something else, Ed went on. Didn't you think that maybe you shouldn't have given the doll so much recognition? It wasn't a doll, Deirdre corrected him. It was the spirit of Annabelle we cared about. That's right, said Lara. I mean, before you knew anything about Annabelle? How are we to know anything? Deirdre asked. But looking back on it now, maybe we shouldn't have given the doll so much credence. But really, we saw the thing as being no more than a harmless mascot. It never hurt anything, at least until the other day. Do you still think that's what's moving the doll is the spirit of a little girl? Lorraine queried. What else could it be? Lara said in reply. It's a damn voodoo doll, that's what it is, Cal blurted out. I told them about that thing a long time ago. The doll was just taking advantage of them. Okay, Cal, I think it's time you told your side of things, Ed remarked to the young man. Let me put it this way. I didn't like the doll, and the doll didn't like me right back, he said. The thing's got a mind, and dolls don't have minds, right? So from the beginning, I didn't think this thing moving around their apartment was cute. Beyond that, tell me about what's happened to you, said Ed. Tell them about the dreams, coaxed Laura. Well, Cal picked up, the thing gives me bad dreams, recurring ones. But yet, what I'm going to tell you is not a dream as far as I'm concerned, because I somehow saw this happen to me. The last time it happened, I fell asleep at home, a really deep sleep. While I was lying there, I saw myself wake up. Something seemed wrong to me. I looked around the room, but nothing was out of place. But then, when I looked down toward my feet, I saw the rag doll Annabelle. It was slowly gliding up my body. It moved across my chest and stopped. Then it put its two arms out. One arm touched one side of my neck, the other touched the other side like it was making an electrical connection. Then I saw myself being strangled. I was writhing and trying to push the doll off my chest, but I might as well have been pushing on a wall because it wouldn't move. I was literally strangling to death, but I couldn't help myself, no matter how hard I tried. Yes, the priest I spoke with said you'd been physically attacked. Is this what you consider to be a physical attack? Ed pressed him. No, Cal asserted. What happened here in the apartment when Laura and I were alone together? It was about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we were reading over maps because I was going off on a trip the next day. Everything was quiet at the time. Suddenly, we both heard sounds in Deirdre's bedroom that made us think that someone had broken into the apartment. I quietly got up and tiptoed to the bedroom door, which was closed. I waited until the noises stopped, then I carefully opened the door and reached in and switched on the light. Nobody was there, except the Annabelle doll was tossed on the floor in a corner. I went in alone and I walked over to the thing to see if anything unusual had happened. But as I got close to the doll, I got the distinct impression that someone was behind me. I swung around instantly and, well, he won't talk about that part, Laura said. When Cal turned around, there wasn't anybody there, but he suddenly yelled and grabbed for his chest. He was doubled over, cut and bleeding when I got to him. Blood was all over his shirt. Cal was shaking and scared, and we went back out into the living room. We then opened up his shirt, and there on his chest was what looked to be a sort of claw mark. Can I see the mark? Ed asked. It's gone now, the young man told him. I saw the cuts on his chest, too, Deirdre spoke up in support. How many were there? Ed asked. 7, said Laura. 3 were vertical, 4 were horizontal.
Did the cuts have any sensation?
All the cuts were hot, like they were burns, Cal told him. Did you ever have cuts or wounds in the same area of your chest before this incident happened? Questioned Ed. No, the young man replied. Did you lose consciousness before or after the attack took place? No, was his answer again.
How long did it take the wounds to heal? Lorraine then wanted to know.
They healed up almost immediately, said Cal. They were half gone the next day and fully gone the day after. Has anything ever happened since that time? Asked Ed.
No, came the joint reply.
Who did you first contact after the incident occurred?
I contacted an Episcopal priest named Father Kevins, Deirdre told Ed and Lorraine. Why did you decide to call him instead of a doctor? Lorraine asked. Do you think someone off the street would have believed where that claw mark on Cal's chest came from? Deirdre asked rhetorically. Besides, we agreed the cuts weren't half as important as how Cal got them. We wanted to know if there was something, if this was going to happen again. Our problem was who to ask. Was there some reason why you specifically called on Father Kevins? Lorraine questioned. Yes, we trust him, said Deirdre. He teaches nearby here at a junior college. Plus Laura and I both know him.
What did you tell the priest? Asked Ed.
The whole story about Annabelle and how it moved on its own, and especially about Cal's cuts, Deirdre replied. At first we were afraid he might not believe us, but that was no problem. He believed us all right, although, she finished, he said he'd never heard of such a thing happening these days. At the time we were all scared out of our wits, and I asked him what he thought about had happened to us.
What did he tell you? Ed asked her.
He said he didn't want to speculate, replied Deirdre, but he did seem to feel it was a spiritual matter, possibly an important one, and said he was going to contact someone higher up in the church, a Father Everett.
That's what he did, Ed told her.
Laura then asked the Warrens concernedly, What do you think did that to Cal's chest?
Let's discuss that in a minute, Ed answered. First, to finish up, let me just ask you a few questions. Has this kind of thing ever happened to you before? To any of you?
No, they told the Warrens.
Did the name Annabelle or Annabelle Higgins mean anything to you in real life before this incident occurred?
No, they again answered.
Although you never saw anything spirit-wise in here, Cal said he felt a presence in the room before he got hurt.
There is something in here, Laura stated firmly. In fact, I can't even stand to be here. We decided to get a new apartment. We're moving out.
I'm afraid that's not going to help you very much, Ed said dryly.
What do you mean? Deirdre asked, astonished.
To put it in a nutshell, folks, you inadvertently brought a spirit into this apartment and into your lives. You're not going to be able to walk away from it that easily. Ed's statement was understandably troubling. Prudently, he and Lorraine remained silent and allowed the three young people to collect their thoughts. After a long minute, Ed spoke again. We're going to be able to help you, beginning right now, today. The first thing I'd like to do is to call Father Everett and have him come over. Then you're going to have to understand what has happened and why Cal got that ugly claw mark on his chest. May I use the phone? Ed had no trouble getting a hold of the Episcopal priest who had been waiting for him to telephone. Lorraine, in the meantime, walked into the living room to discern the spirit presence that was in the apartment. After the phone call, the Warrens both turned to the kitchen and the others. All right, Ed said matter-of-factly. When Father Everett comes here, he's going to have to perform a sort of blessing, an exorcism of the premises. I knew it, Cal proclaimed. I knew it would lead to this. Yes, I think you did, Ed told him. But I'm not sure any of you know the reason why. To begin with, there is no Annabelle. There never was. You were duped. However, we are dealing with a spirit here. The appearance of notes written... Excuse me. The teleportation of the doll while you were out of the apartment. The appearance of notes written on parchment. The manifestation of 3 symbolic drops of blood plus the gestures the doll made are all meaningful. They tell me there was intent, which means that there was an intelligence behind the activity. But ghosts, human spirits, plain and simple, can't bring on phenomena on this nature and intensity. They don't have the power. Instead, what's taken over here is something inhuman. Inhuman? Cal asked, perplexed. Demonic, Ed told him immediately. Ordinarily, people are never bothered by inhuman demonic spirits unless they do something to bring the force into their lives. And I regret to say, you girls did something to bring the demonic into your lives. Like what? Deirdre urgently wanted to know. Well, for the most part, you made honest mistakes, but in this case, you made the wrong mistakes, replied Ed. Your first mistake was to have given the doll so much recognition. You see, the reason why the spirit moved the doll in the first place was to draw attention to itself. Once it had your attention, it exploited you. Rather than reciprocating your care and concern, it simply brought you fear and even injury. This is the nature of the inhuman spirit. It's negative. It enjoys inflicting pain. Right at the very beginning, you should have been intolerant of the unnatural activity. However, instead of cutting the thing off at the start, it aroused your curiosity, and that fact got noticed supernaturally. Your next mistake was in calling a medium, it went on. Whoever functioned as the medium was unwittingly used as an instrument of communication by the entity. During the sitting, this inhuman spirit fed you false information. The demonic is a liar. It's even been called the father of lies. Well, you were lied to by a spirit of deception, and unknowingly you believed the lie. Your worst mistake, though, was in giving the spirit the permission it needed to move into the doll. That's what it wanted, and it preyed off your ignorance of its existence to do so. Why? Asked Lara. Because to really interfere in your life, the demonic has somehow got to get your permission to do so. And unfortunately, through your own free will, you gave it that permission. It was like handing a maniac a loaded gun. Then the doll is possessed? Questioned Deirdre. No, the doll is not possessed. Spirits don't possess things. Spirits possess people, Ed informed her. Instead, the spirit simply moved the doll around and gave it the illusion of being alive. But because you girls believed this was the spirit of a little girl, Annabelle, the appearance and reality were the same to you. In short, you left yourselves wide open, and a deceptive, negative spirit took advantage of you, with your permission, of course. This is how the phenomena was brought on. Ed paused to see if there were any further questions, but none were asked. Now, what happened to Cal earlier this week, it proceeded, was bound to occur sooner or later. In fact, you all stood in jeopardy of coming under possession by this spirit. This is what the thing was really after. But Cal here didn't believe in the charade, so he was an ongoing threat to the entity. One way or another, there was bound to be a showdown. And what happened? For starters, it tried to strangle Cal to death. When that failed, it cut him with a symbolic claw mark. We've seen this claw mark in other cases. It's a telltale sign of an inhuman presence. You got off easy this time. Had this spirit been given another week or two, you might all have been killed. Is this demonic spirit in the apartment now? Laura asked, petrified. Yes, I'm afraid so, Lorraine answered. There is only one entity involved, but its behavior is completely unpredictable. The Warrens' words seemed to hit home. You're for real, aren't you? Deirdre said incredulously. The front door bell rang. Father Everett had arrived. The interview session ended in the kitchen as Deirdre got up and answered the door. With the sun about to go down in an hour, Ed was eager to have the house blessed, remove the doll, and return home. As the Warrens packed up their gear, Father Everett, whom Ed and Lorraine had never met in person, came into the kitchen. A tall, middle-aged man, the Episcopal priest was clearly uncomfortable in his role as exorcist. Once the preliminary greetings were out of the way, Ed then told the priest that in his judgment, the spirit that was responsible for the malicious activity was inhuman, that it was still in the apartment, and the only way it could be made to leave was through the power of the words written in the exorcism blessing. I'm not totally familiar with demonology, admitted Father Everett. How do you know such a spirit is behind the disturbance? Well, in this case, it wasn't all that difficult to determine, Ed said frankly. These spirits work in characteristic ways. What's going on here is essentially the infestation stage of the phenomena. A spirit, in this case an inhuman demonic spirit, began moving the doll around the apartment through teleportation and other means. Once it aroused the girl's curiosity, which was the spirit's purpose in moving the doll, they made the predictable mistake of bringing a medium in here, who took matters a step further. She told them, in the trance state, that a little girl named Annabelle was moving the doll. Communicating through the medium, the entity preyed on the girl's emotional vulnerabilities, and during the seance managed to extract permission from them to go about its business. Insofar as the demonic is a negative entity, it then set about causing patently negative phenomena to occur. It aroused fear through the weird movements of the doll. It brought about the materialization of disturbing handwritten notes. It left a residue of blood on the doll, and ultimately it even struck the young man Cal on the chest with a bloody claw mark. Beyond the activity, Lorraine has also discerned that this inhuman spirit is with us now. Lorraine's an excellent clairvoyant, and she's never been wrong about the nature of a spirit that's present. However, if you want to go a step further, we can challenge the entity right now with a religious provocation. You'd be able to see for yourself. No, I don't think so, replied Father Everett. Why don't I just do what has to be done? In this case, the recitation of the exorcism blessing took the priest about 5 minutes to perform in each room of the apartment. The Episcopal blessing of a home is a wordy 7-page document that is distinctly positive in nature. Rather than specifically expelling evil entities from the dwelling, the emphasis is instead directed toward filling the home with the power of the positive, the power of God. There was no trouble or mishap during the procedure. When he was finished, the priest then blessed the individuals who were present, and after doing so, declared all was well. Lorraine also confirmed that the apartment and the people were free from the infesting spirit entity. Ed and Lorraine's work done, they then took their leave and started for home, at Deirdre's request. And as a further precaution against the phenomena ever occurring in the apartment again, the Warrens took the big rag doll along with them. Placing Annabelle in the back seat of the car, Ed decided it was safer to avoid traveling on the interstate in case the entity had not been separated from the rag doll. His hunch was correct. In no time at all, Ed and Lorraine Warren felt themselves the object of a vicious hatred. Then, at each dangerous curve in the road, their new car began to stall, causing the power steering and brakes to fail. Repeatedly, the car verged on collision. Of course, it would have been easy to stop and throw the doll into the woods. But if the profane item didn't simply teleport back to the girl's apartment, at the least, it would place anyone who found it in jeopardy. The third time the car stalled along the road, Ed reached into his black bag, took out a vial, and threw a sprinkling of holy water on the rag doll, making the sign of the cross over it. The disturbance in the car stopped immediately, allowing the Warrens to reach home safely. For the next few days, Ed sat the doll in a chair next to his desk. The doll levitated a number of times in the beginning. Then it seemed to fall inert. During the ensuing weeks, however, it began showing up in various rooms of the house. When the Warrens were away and had the doll locked up in the outer office building, they would often return to find it sitting comfortably upstairs in Ed's easy chair when they opened the main front door. It also turned out that Annabelle came with a friend, a black cat, that would occasionally materialize beside the doll. The cat would stalk around the floor, taking particular notice of books and other objects in Ed's office, then return to the doll's side and dematerialize from the head down. It also became apparent that Annabelle hated clergymen. During the follow-up process on the case, it was necessary for the Warrens to consult the Episcopal priests associated with the incident in the young nurse's apartment. Returning home alone one evening, Lorraine was terrified by loud, rolling growls that reverberated through the house. Later, when she was listening to the playback on the telephone answering machine, there were back-to-back calls from Father Kevin's. Between his two calls was recorded the incredible growling noises she'd heard earlier in the house. One day, Father Daniel Mills, a Catholic exorcist, who had been working with Ed and asked about the new addition to the office, Annabelle. Ed told Father Daniel about the case and gave him the paperwork for his review. After hearing Ed's account of what had happened, the priest picked up the rag doll and offhandedly said, "You're just a rag doll, Annabelle. You can't hurt anything." The priest then tossed the stuffed figure back on the chair. "That's one thing you'd better not say again," Ed warned him with a laugh. Yet when Father Daniel stopped to say goodbye to Lorraine, upon leaving an hour later, she pleaded that he be especially careful driving, and insisted that he call her just as soon as he arrived at the rectory. "I discern tragedy for that young priest," said Lorraine, "but he had to go his way." A few hours later, the telephone rang. "Lorraine," said Father Daniel, "why did you tell me to be careful driving?" "Because," she told him, "your car would go out of control. You would have an accident." "Well, you were right," he stated flatly. "The brake system failed. I was almost killed in a traffic accident. My car is a wreck." Later in the year, at a large social gathering at the Warrens' home, Lorraine and Father Daniel went into the den to chat for a few moments. By a strange coincidence, Annabelle had moved into that room the day before. While speaking with Lorraine, the priest saw an ornamental wall decoration make a quick movement. Suddenly, the 24-inch long boar's tooth necklace above them exploded with percussive force. Hearing the stunning noise, other guests immediately converged on the room, at which time someone in the crowd had the foresight to snap a photograph. When developed, the print was otherwise normal, except above the doll were two beacons of bright light, both pointing in the direction of Father Daniel Mills. On another occasion, Ed recounts, "I was in my office working with a police detective on a case that concerned a witchcraft-related murder in the area. As a cop, he's seen every kind of crime. He's definitely not the sort of man who gets scared." While we were talking, Lorraine called me upstairs to take a long-distance call. I told the detective he was free to look around in my office, but to be careful and not touch any of the objects because they'd come from cases where the demonic had been invoked. Well, I wasn't away any more than 5 minutes when upstairs came this detective, stark white. When I asked him what had happened, he refused to tell me, Ed remembers, breaking into a grin. He just kept mumbling, The doll, the rag doll is real." He was talking about Annabelle, of course. That little doll made a believer out of him. In fact, as I think back on it, any meetings I've had with a detective from that day on have always been in his office. "Just last week, a similar incident occurred here," Lorraine adds. "While Ed was away in Scotland, we had a carpenter over to build additional bookshelves in his office. The carpenter came upstairs and asked me if I'd moved the Raggedy Ann doll to another place so he could continue working. In all honesty, the doll scares me, but Ed wasn't around, so I had to move it. Profane objects like the Annabelle doll have their own aura. When you touch them, your human aura mingles with theirs. This change immediately attracts spirits. It's almost like setting off a fire alarm. Therefore, for protection, I blessed myself with holy water, then blessed the rag doll with holy water in the sign of the cross. When I asked the carpenter if he wanted to bless himself too, he gave me a kind of accommodating smile, saying he didn't believe in spirits or religion, and told me he'd pass on the holy business." Now, our tabby cat Marcy had been lying around in Ed's office as she always does. Just as soon as I picked up Annabelle to move her across the room, Marcy's hair was raised up, and she began screeching in pain terror. She edged over to the outside door and began making a strange-sounding call I'd never heard a cat make before. Marcy wouldn't stop until I opened the office door and let her out in the sunlight. The carpenter watched all of this in amazement. Then, without saying a word, he reached over, took the holy water bottle from my hand,
she says, smiling openly, and promptly blessed himself with it. Like I say when we're doing field work, I've never met an atheist in a haunted house. It's difficult for people to accept the existence of something they've been conditioned not to believe in, Ed asserts. Still, lack of knowledge allowed this negative spirit to wrangle its way into the lives of three unwary young people. Had they known such sinister spirits existed, then it's quite likely that today a young man would not have been physically struck with the mark of the beast. Many, there nevertheless, contend that the notion of spirits is irrational or unfounded. They say the phenomena is an illusion, or hallucination, or that it doesn't exist at all. At best, the activity can be explained away by science. Or can it? Recently, the Warrens broached this very subject on nationwide television. End of chapter 3.